Catholic and Anglican models of evangelism? How could we be people who take the Mass so seriously that we are a sent-out apostolic church? And I think what I want to say to you is that the best evangelism of all, without question, the best evangelism of all, is the Christ-like witness of ordinary Christian men and women in their daily lives. That's what I long for. And I long for those of us who are priests and bishops. I long for us to stop being the people who think that our job is to do all the ministry and become the people who realise that we're the ones who make sure the ministry is done. That we recognise that the biblical Catholic vision is that ministry belongs to the whole people of God, to all the baptised, that we the baptised are the apostolic sent-out church. And our job, the priestly vocation as ministers of word and sacrament, is to lead and teach, inspire and enable the whole church to be the missionary apostolic church of God. And when we raise the temperature of the church to apostolic level, then evangelism just happens. And you can stop going to who is to talk about it. It just happens. It happens because people's lives are transformed, and out of the abundance of the heart, out of the things that people have received, out of the things that have shaped and formed people, the gospel just starts to flow. Now, I believe this is true, not just because I've read about it, even in the Bible, though I have read about it in the Bible, page after page after page. The scriptures are full of stories of men and women whose lives have been and are being transformed. No, that's not the reason I believe it. The reason I believe it is because I've seen it. Just let me tell you two stories. First story, somebody whose name may be familiar to some of you, Brother Roger of Taizé. I first visited the Taizé community in France. The Taizé community is an ecumenical community. Frère Roger was a Swiss Lutheran, I think. He formed the community in the dying days of the Second World War because there was such a need for reconciliation in Europe. And he believed if the church could be reconciled, then maybe the world could be reconciled. He was a man with a big vision. He formed a small monastic community in Burgundy of different denominations. And they became, as it were, a parable of what Christian community and reconciliation might look like. As you may know, thousands of young people from all over the world travel to Taizé because it is a place where people are formed in order to be sent, where their lives are changed, where they experience reconciliation between different Christian denominations and between different nations. And then they are sent out and sent back to live that reconciliation in the world. I went there for the first time, I guess it must be 30 years ago, maybe more. The liturgy in Taizé is very beautiful, but rather long. They certainly have renegotiated the contract. So when the formal liturgy comes to an end, say evening prayer in Taizé, although you know it's finished and you can go, actually the worship just overflows and carries on. And you'll be familiar, I'm sure, with the beautiful Taizé chant. Though I have to, anybody here been to Taizé other than me? Oh, lots of you. Oh, right, great. So you're familiar with what I'm talking about. Though I have to say, this terrible confession, when I go to Taizé, after a few days, I'm absolutely fed up with Taizé chant, and I'm longing to sing Victorian English hymns, you know, like stand up for Jesus, or onward Christian soldiers. But that's just me. But it is very, very beautiful, and the liturgy is very beautiful. And they have this thing, don't they, that at the end of the liturgy, the brothers of the community just come and stand around the outside of the worshipping community, they are available. If you want to pray, if you want somebody to bless you, if you want to make your confession, there's somebody there for you. Incidentally, might that be something we would do if we renegotiated the contract? Why do we priests stand at the door at the end of the service? I'm not saying that's wrong, but why do we stand at the door shaking hands? Why don't we sit over here and say, if you want somebody to pray for you, if you want to be blessed, if you want to make your confession, I'm here. Why don't we train a group of lay people to also participate in such a ministry? Anyway, on my first evening at Teze, many years ago, I was sitting, our eldest son, who was just a tiny baby at that point, was with us, and we sat right at the back because we were worried that he might be disruptive. And so when the service ended and the brothers of the community came and stood around the worshipping community, Brother Roger came and stood maybe just 5 or 6 feet away from me. And as soon as he came and stood so close, a crowd gathered around him. Many people wanted to talk to him, wanted to receive his blessing, wanted him to pray for them. I was so close to him, but I didn't want to talk to him. I didn't want him to pray for me. I didn't want him to give me his blessing. I wanted to touch him. There was such a radiant holiness about him that as I stood and beheld him, I had this overwhelming feeling that if I touched him, that somehow I would receive that radiant, translucent holiness, and then it would come to me like electricity. You know that story in the Gospels where the woman who has been hemorrhaging for so many years, in so much distress and discomfort, she just reaches out and touches the hem of Jesus' garment. Suddenly, that story from the Gospels became so real for me. I felt I just needed to touch this man and somehow to be in touch with and receive his holiness. But the reason I'm telling you this is because although that was so gloriously and transparently real in this man of such great holiness, one of the great saints of the 20th century, the point is I also want to tell you about Everil. Now, Everil was a woman in my congregation when I was a parish priest, only she wasn't to begin with. Her husband, Edwin, had been a church warden of the church, and when I got there as parish priest, he was very sick and housebound. But because he was such a faithful Christian but who could no longer make it to church, I took him the sacrament at home every week, like many of us clergy do. He was on my, what we called the home communion list. And every Tuesday I visited Edwin and I took him communion. His wife Everil never came to church. And I always thought Everil is a bit hostile to the church. She'd never been, never came. Because when I went to take Edwin communion, she hardly spoke to me. She opened the door, ushered me into the sitting room where Edwin was, and then withdrew. So when Edwin died, and I went round to see Everil to arrange the funeral, I went with some trepidation, because I thought, oh, Edwin, a man of great faith, but his wife quite hostile to the church. And when I sat down with Everil, she told me this. She told me that every Tuesday, when I had visited to take Edwin the sacrament, and my predecessor before me, every Tuesday her kitchen was right next to the sitting room. So she would go into the kitchen, she would pull up a chair right against the wall, she would press her ear against the wall, and she would join in the prayers of the liturgy. Because she had never been baptized and never been confirmed, she thought she wasn't allowed to participate in what was happening. You know, well, you can imagine, I felt such a failure as a priest in that moment that I had misread her trepidation and anxiety about participation as hostility. I was terribly wrong. And I apologised to her. And I said to her, but Everil, you know, it is never too late to become part of the household of God. And so on the day when Everil was baptised and was confirmed and did receive communion for the first time, that was a glorious day. And the amazing thing about Everil was that because she was so late coming to the Christian faith, she was blessedly free of all the baggage that many of us carry around. So nobody had told her that we Anglicans don't invite other people to come to church. Nobody had told her that. So Everil became the most effective evangelist in our church. I think I told you yesterday about the growth in our Wednesday congregation. That it grew from about half a dozen to when I left between 30 and 40. Most of that was Everil. As well as regular on Sunday, she became almost a daily communicant. She was certainly there every Wednesday, and she evangelised her whole network of friends, many of whom either returned to faith or were confirmed. And there was a beauty and a radiant holiness about Everil. Even in that late autumn of her life, there was the springtime of Christian faith. That can happen to everyone. That is the Christian vocation. We, with our unveiled faces, seeing and beholding the glory of God, reflect that glory. Now, that is shaped and sustained by a life of prayer, by the receiving of the sacraments, by the brooding upon the scriptures. But it is a beautiful holiness, which is, well, it's what I long for. So what I've tried to do with you in these few days is kind of take you through these words. Not because I've got all the answers, but because I think these words are important for Anglican and Catholic understanding of evangelism. And first and foremost, it is contemplative, because it is about the life of prayer, and it is allowing God to inhabit and shape our lives. It is catechumenal because we recognise that for most people becoming a Christian is like a journey, therefore the work of evangelism will be helping people make that journey, and therefore we need to build our places of nurture, and also we need to help people grow in discipleship, and that means all sorts of things like small creative one-offs, like inhabiting the Christian year, like asking ourselves what might our church look like if it was more a school of disciples that was not just about gathering people in, but about sending them out. And therefore it is ecclesial, which means it is about becoming part of the church, and we shouldn't apologise for that. We shouldn't buy into that individualistic approach to Christian faith, where it's just about me and Jesus. It's about me and Jesus, and we are his body, therefore it is about the church. It is sacramental, because until that day when we see Jesus face to face, Jesus gives us the sacraments as channels of grace, as means whereby we not simply behold but also receive his presence with us. It is prophetic, because it is about a vision for the whole world, not just for the church, and we long to change the world. And it is only by being people who dwell deeply in the presence of God, who brood deeply upon the scriptures, that we catch hold of that vision of what a changed world might look like. And it is beautiful. I don't just mean Catholic liturgy is beautiful. I mean we should use all the beauty of our own creativity in the different ways in which we present the Christian faith. And I think it's because holiness is beautiful. Everil was the most beautiful woman. Brother Roger evidenced in his life the beauty of holiness. And I'm sure that as I'm speaking to you about these people, I'm sure that you in your own lives can reflect upon people for whom this has been true. I'm sure you could name people who have been holy, and simply to be in their presence was to be closely in the presence of God. I remember Blanche in the parish where I served my title. Blanche lived in a council flat on the whatever it was floor of a council estate in South London, a very poor area. Her little council flat was like a shrine, even though she could barely get out. There were endless visitors to Blanche's flat because Blanche was a woman of prayer. And I remember visiting Blanche on her deathbed, and I sat beside. She was unconscious. She was dying. I just sat, there was no conversation, nothing to do. I just sat there for a little while. I held her hand. I said some prayers, but I didn't think she was able to hear them. Death was close. And then just for a few moments she opened her eyes and came to and smiled at me and said, "Oh, Father Stephen." I said, "Oh, Blanche." She said, "Oh, Father Stephen, when you feel the prick of the crown of thorns, you know he's very close." And then she died. The Christian faith is so beautiful. I remember in my parish one Easter day, the beautiful reading set for Easter Day, Mary Magdalene in the garden. And I remember reading the gospel before I was about to preach, and I just was overwhelmed by the beauty of it. And I'm one of those people, I'm starting to do it now, I'm one of those people who rather debases the currency of tears. It doesn't get much to get me crying. So I'm reading the gospel and I just find myself in floods of tears because it's so beautiful. And the congregation, however, are a bit anxious. What's happened to our parish priest? Is he having a nervous breakdown? Has his wife left him? What's the matter? And just as I'm finishing reading the gospel, I think they're nudging the church warden to check I'm out. So the church warden just sort of comes towards me and says, "Oh, is everything okay?" And I turned to him and the congregation and said, "Oh yes, I'm fine." I said, "It's just that the Christian story is so beautiful." And do you know, my big regret is, I'll always carry this regret with me, I still went on to preach my sermon, which was a big mistake. I think if I just, having wept at reading the gospel and said, "It's just so beautiful," I'm sure if I'd sat down there, it would have been the best sermon I'd ever preached. But I stupidly ploughed on with whatever half-baked stuff about the resurrection that I'd cobbled together the night before. So, you'll be relieved to hear that I've just about finished. I think these words are important. I hope you'll take away one or two practical challenges for your churches, but most of all I hope you'll take away a renewed confidence in being Anglican Catholic Christians. that what we have to share is good news for the church, good news of the world, and something so beautiful that it will be compelling to those who long for truth and beauty in their own lives. But you won't be surprised to hear, before I finish, I have a picture, a story, and a poem. So let's have the story. We'll have the story first, then the picture, then the poem. So, the story. There was once a priest who's preaching his heart out on John 15. John 15, I am the vine, you are the branches, cut off from me, you can do nothing. We want to make, God wants to make his home in us, abide with me, all that stuff. You know the passage. Could be your homework for tonight. Read John chapter 15. So he's preaching his heart out on John chapter 15. He's talking about how important it is that we invite Christ to dwell in our lives, to inhabit us, because then we will be fruitful. After the Mass, there's a little boy in the congregation who's heard the sermon. He comes up to the priest after the sermon and says, "Father, I didn't understand your sermon." "Oh," says the priest, "what didn't you understand about it?" He said, "Well, it sounded like you were saying that we need to invite Jesus to come and live in our hearts." And the priest said, oh no, you did understand the sermon. In fact, you've summed it up rather well. That was what I was saying. That is the heart of the Christian life. That in the sacraments, in the word, in our worship and our fellowship, we invite Christ to take his place at the centre of our lives, and that changes everything. And that we are transformed, that we become ourselves Christ-like. And that is the way we will live and share the gospel. It's not something we have control over, but it's the beauty of the gospel transmitted through our humanity. Well, says the little boy, "Yeah, okay." He says, "But this is my problem. Jesus is so big, and I am so small. If Jesus came and lived in my heart, wouldn't he burst out all over the place?" And the priest said, "Yes, that is exactly how it works." So that story sums up my whole theology of mission. Now the picture. This picture is by, not a particularly well-known or famous, renowned English artist called Ian Johnson. This picture sits in a church right up on the Scottish borders in the north of England, and it was commissioned in the millennium year, so 19 years ago. And the commission was a very generous, open commission from the parish church. They just said, it's the second Christian millennium. We want to have a portrait, an image of Christ to hang in the parish church. We commissioned this artist to make one. All it said was, we want the face of Christ. So when you look at it, it's not particularly, to me, not a particularly interesting image of Christ. It looks like a rather predictable white Anglo-Saxon Hollywood kind of Christ, not a particularly compelling image, until even from where you're sitting you might puzzle at it and think, I wonder how it's made. And actually it's a collage. And it's a collage that is made up of hundreds and hundreds of photographs. So this is what happened. This is a relatively small rural community. So the artist gathered together everybody in the community who could come in the village hall, and he gave each of them a camera with a reel of disposable film, if you remember such things from 19 years ago. This is just on the cusp of the digital revolution. So a camera with disposable film, and he says to the people, so go out, go home, He commissions them, he sends them out. Go and take photographs of things that you love and things that you value, and then next week we come back again and you hand all the cameras in. So people went off and took photographs of things they loved and things they valued, and as I tell you this story, you might like to imagine if you were taking part, what would you take photographs of? So I would take photographs of my wife, of course, my kids, my fridge. Yeah, I would. I'd take these things I would photograph. So people came back the next week, they handed in the cameras, the artist got all the film developed, and from these hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of photographs, he created this image of Christ. Then came the day of the unveiling of the portrait of Christ in the parish church. Again, the whole community is gathered. This is a great big community art project. And when the face of Christ was unveiled, something very beautiful happened. Because people saw the image of Christ, and they also saw themselves and the things and the people that they loved and valued recreated and reconnected in Christ. Then they saw their neighbours and the things their neighbours loved and valued recreated and reconnected in Christ. And then, slightly more disturbing, they saw their enemies and the things their enemies loved and valued reconnected and you know what human communities are like. We've spoken about the beauty of holiness. We need also to acknowledge the ugliness, the absolute ugliness of human sinfulness and division, of cruelty, of prejudice, of hatred, of the ways we divide ourselves against each other, the way we nurse grudges against each other. We are so good at building walls around ourselves. We're so good at dividing ourselves from each other. We are so good at not loving each other. And rural communities are sometimes the worst of all, because there's no hiding from your enemies there, so you can really nurse that grudge. I must tell you my favourite story on this. My favourite story is of two parish communities on the east coast of England that the Archdeacon was trying to get to, collaborate in some way, and having no luck whatsoever, even getting the parishes to sit down and talk about the possibility of collaborating in ministry. So in exasperation, he gets the church wardens together and says to the church wardens, look, I don't understand why you won't even sit down and talk about the possibility of some sort of collaboration. And one church warden says, Archdeacon, you need to understand, they never told us when the Vikings were coming. Now that, I can assure you, is a grudge nursed over a very, very long period. But that's what we're good at. And so it was beautiful, but also deeply disturbing to see not just yourself, not just your friends, but also your enemies and the things they loved, the things they valued, and also disturbing to discover that your enemies seem to value and love some of the same things that you valued and loved. If you look closely at this image, many of all the green is the scenery around this very beautiful part of England, which everybody loved. So when I saw the picture in this way, I saw it as a picture of Christian mission. That this is what God is longing to do, and what God is constantly expending God's self in doing, to bring everything and the whole creation, to gather it together in Christ. As I may have mentioned already, one of my favourite passages in Scripture, again, John chapter 6, where Jesus says to the disciples after the crowds have been fed, Gather up all the fragments, let nothing be lost. And that's what I saw in this image, that the courteous, gracious, ever-expanding God was gathering everything and everyone together. The great biblical vision of a new heaven and a new earth where nothing is lost. And finally, a poem. And a few years ago I walked the Camino to Santiago. I promised myself I wouldn't write a book. I failed. I've been very good, haven't I, about not advertising my books, but I need to tell you that I do sometimes lie awake at night and worry about how people can live the Christian life without reading my books. Amazingly, some people seem to do it, amazingly. But it's probably too late. The bookstore's probably closed now, but there are some available downstairs, though not this one, which is a book of poems, mainly a book of poems. That when I walk the Camino, I set myself the happy task of writing a sonnet every day in my head, and then writing them down in the evening. And because I had this bloody great pack on my back, I found myself both thinking about Christ, thinking about pilgrimage, but also thinking about weight, the weights that we carry. And so with this image in mind of the Christ who gathers everything together, even the heavy burdens that we bear, can I finish with this poem? It's called, I Know a Man Who Carries Heavy Loads. I know a man who carries heavy loads, for whom no weight's too sharp, nor yet too sheer, who does not ask whence such a burden came, or why it has been carried all these years, but does not share it, splitting half with half, or say, you get what you deserve, no less. It is for ones like me still undeserving that he comes to shoulder and to bless. He picks up what you press on him and chides you with a smile if you persist in keeping what you cannot bear. His heart is strong, though not a strength incapable of weeping. Oh, come to him, if broken, burdened, sad. In holding you, this strong man's heart is glad.